Welcome both. So welcome to today's speaker series. We have speaker series throughout the festival on the weekends, and you can check our website to get the full schedule of events, or there at the front you will find a festival program which will share that information as well. So today's speaker series is Education in the Arts, and I'm joined by Selma Catovic Hughes, the US mission to the UAE Grant Artist recipient, and her work is being displayed in Bait 7 right now, if you'd like to check that out after the speaker series. And she's currently an instructor at American University of Sharjah, AUS. We're also joined by Dr. Sabir Haque, who's the assistant professor at the American University of Khaimah, and he's a professor in digital media and video production. So these two professionals are here to share their experience of how art has affected their lives, why education in the arts is such a vital part of our society, and how we as individuals and leaders can encourage more students to take part in creative education. And for those of you who knew about this event in advance, please kindly note that Guan Yu was unfortunately unable to attend this evening due to some health concerns. But without further ado, I'd like to first ask if you could introduce yourself a little bit more and tell us a bit more about your profession. So Selma, if you want to start with you.
Ladies first, all right. So thank you for the brief introduction. I am Selma Catovic Hughes, originally from Bosnia. When I was 18 and finishing high school, I received a scholarship to go to the United States. And that's kind of my first journey, where I studied architecture, both undergraduate and master's. And then I worked kind of the typical, let's say, architect sort of job for 10 years, doing some consulting, some work on my own. Then started a family, and then the opportunity came about to move to AUS, to Sharjah, and I was with two little kids. My son was like 2 years, and my daughter was 2 months. So I knew right away that there's no way I can take on real architecture jobs again. So I enjoyed being a mom for a year, but you know, I was itching to just channel my creativity into something. So I slowly started doing like design projects. I mean, always in my even undergraduate and graduate, there was this overlap of what maybe some would consider a true architecture project and an overlap of mixed media. And so it wasn't a difficult transition for me, but I just wanted to feel accomplished, to like make a photo collage in Photoshop in an hour and to say I started, I finished, and look. That was like the mother's goal when you have toddlers. And so that just kind of gradually evolved into more of that kind of digital work. Then things developed into doing pottery and doing some sculpture work. And then first time I actually exhibited was at SICA in Dubai in 2017, I think. And that just kind of exploded and opened doors for me, meeting different people, other opportunities, me then finding out about different festivals. And so the Fine Arts Festival in Ras Al Khaimah, I first joined 3 years ago and presented. So it just kind of, now I still teach architecture, really design foundations, but I can see that this kind of, the link between real architecture and structure with other designs is very much woven together. You can't really pull them apart. So I teach that way as well. So it's not kind of like that we separate ourselves. I think these days students are really taught from the beginning to kind of be more overlapped with different mediums, no matter what they're doing, just to expose them to different criterias and things.
And Sabir, as well, if you could introduce yourself and if you have any comments or further additions on what Selma said.
So I really like the part where she mentioned that you cannot compartmentalize anymore. And particularly with internet, I think it has just exploded, it's difficult to contain one medium to itself. So I come from a traditional TV broadcast background. I'm grounded in filmmaking, particularly documentary filmmaking. So my first exposure to film happened when I was doing my master's, and there was a course called Film Appreciation, and I was just exposed to films from all over the world, across the history of cinema. I think that really opened my eyes in terms of how powerful film can be. And that just hooked me. And the very idea that you can connect and talk about people's life, social lives, and film can be such an effective medium. Just what influenced me and made me believe that if our students can be trained in storytelling, and if you look at what's happening today, I mean, I'm talking about 10, 15 years back, but what's happening today, every social media platform have time and again come ahead and say, okay, video is in, and that's what is going to, drive content. If you look at TikTok and look at other platforms, which I'm sure the students and the younger generation are more familiar with than us, that just shows the power of film, power of video. So I think having a background in television really helped me to understand, where we began, and this whole, movement from analog to digital. I was probably the first generation video editors in India when we moved from analog to digital. So we were at the cusp of that revolution. We were saying goodbye to a lot of great professionals who were great in analog video, and they used to hate us because we just got in and we just, we're the new generation non-linear editors. So it's quite interesting because, I consider myself quite lucky because I saw the very beginning of digital media. And that's what we focus in when I teach at American University, and our focus is basic digital media. And as I mentioned, it's evolving with new platforms, Meta making an appearance. So I mean, it's
right. I mean, digital media is different every year. There's always new methods and methodologies around digital and what digital means. So if you both now work within higher education, having started out as an editor and then as an architect, can you talk a little bit more about what motivated you to move into working within higher education and working within education in the arts? And Selma, for you as well, what it means now to be a teaching artist.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, even before we actually moved here in the Emirates, I did, during my master's, I was like a graduate assistant, so I taught the undergraduate first levels. But that was, the relationship there, like you're basically just an older student, so they see you a little bit less as authority and like, okay, it's cool, you know a little more stuff, but like, do you really know everything? Like, should you be teaching me, kind of thing? But regardless whether it's in the States or here, what I find the students, especially first-year students, they're, as we call, like a blank slate. You really can introduce, because I would say around the world, it is rare for any educational system to have a very strong arts program, unless it's very specifically driven, like a high school that's for arts. So, in other words, it's lacking greatly. And I think it's only like if students are talented, meaning they can draw my portrait that looks exactly like me, then they're ready for it. If you can't do that, you're not an artist, go do engineering or something, right? So I think a lot of kids get discouraged from younger age to not pursue different creative outlets. And so when they come to college, they kind of know that they have skills, maybe in some drawing, that they are good in math, which is questionable. Do you really need that in architecture when we have wonderful structural engineers that will do all of that for us? But they definitely, I think, are a little bit, closed in of their expectations. And when you begin to open up these other venues, that it's not this strictly one path, they are quite shocked, actually, of what they can do. Like, what do you mean? I can actually, like, do a painting to start my project? Yes, absolutely. I can do a poem to start it, architecture project, please do. So I think they just kind of, like, almost don't believe it, that these are the possibilities. They weren't told in high school by the advisor, right? There's certain columns of where you should fit in. And so I feel quite good to be in that first level studios where we really explore different mediums for these students to know that it's really limitless. Like they can really experiment and test different things. And sometimes they realize they're not for architecture, that they're a bit more for film or design or printmaking or like more two-dimensional versus three-dimensional. So it's good to kind of see them so fresh and in some ways to mold or just help them mold their opinions of how to continue then.
Sabir, is it quite similar for you then in the film industry?
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar. I think, you know, when we, my experience with very younger children, I mean, you know, I have done workshop with schools, and right now, schools have taken a conscious move, you know, and it's because of new media. It's because of digital media. I mean, even if the school is not really interested, the students themselves go out and learn things. I mean, I met so many students at a very young age who have active channels on YouTube and they are producing content, you know, and that's something which is just unstoppable. You just cannot stop it because it's just so easy, because of mobile phones, accessible. So the entry to making a video today is, it's nothing. It's nothing. And I think it's because of basically mobile phones and because of the best of mobile phones, best of iPhones coming. So I think the barrier to creating content, the barrier to expression has completely gone. So that's good news. That's good news. And I think that's where we get in. And then you know, the getting into a traditional mode of telling a story and explaining students that this is the right way and this is how you. Because people kind of get carried away and they think, okay, if I shoot, I go ahead and that's it. But you know, you have to really structure your thoughts into, so you have to do a lot of pre-production. So my workshop are aimed basically to just tell the students, okay, let's first get together, let's frame the story first. Technology, everything is there. I mean, you can always move ahead. But that's important. I think that's what the schools are focusing in today, and that's great. And I think that's a good way forward.
And it's interesting, you talked about a lot of positives there with it being so accessible, and Selma, you were talking about a lot of institutional challenges that, so I'm curious, you talked about institutional, but are there any personal challenges that students might face or need to overcome if they're wanting to get involved in the creative sector, whether in filmmaking or in architecture or any other artistic discipline?
I think from the experiences that I've had is what I mentioned a bit a minute ago. Unless they're like ultra talented painters or drawers, they are from young age, sometimes even from parents, really discouraged that that is not the route to go. And so they don't really get the opportunity to explore other mediums, other platforms. From personal experiences, I was never really a great drawer. Like I drew okay, but it wasn't like my passion or anything. I like to make things with hands, not even structures, but you know, like sewing things and stuff like that. And I vividly remember when I was in high school, when we were sort of like halfway through it, and I had one friend who was like super good in drawing. Like she could sit and draw this like perfect portrait. The other one was a poet, writer. Another one was musician, and then they turned to me. So they like kind of designated paths for themselves. Okay, you're gonna become designer, you're gonna be a musician, whatever. And then they turned to me. I was like an overall good student. They're like, what are you good at? And I was like, I don't know, I guess lots of little things. And so it kind of, if it was, my personality was different, I'd probably be a little bit crushed and go like, okay, let me see where I have A's. I don't know, physics, biology, I'll go do medicine, right? But it didn't change me, but when I reflect back, I can see how young people could be discouraged, right? Because they're not like their friend who can really draw amazing things, right? So when I came to United States, I had a host family who sponsored my stay and scholarship and everything, and they asked me, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I would really like to study architecture, but I'll study anything. Just enroll me. I'm just happy to be here. Just give me any classes. They're like, no. If you like architecture, that's what you're going to study. And then you discover there was a little bit maybe, let's say, pressure and nervousness, like, do I have capacities? And then you come in and you realize it's not about drawing perfectly. You learn those things. It's about, can you figure out a way to express, as you say, storytelling, because we tell stories through everything, right? It's not just in a film, but we tell stories through drawings, through buildings, everything that we make. And so you have to find your own way to express this creativity in your way, right? It looks different than from someone who can draw perfectly, like a true artist, as we would say. But there are so many different ways that you can show that and people can understand and tell your story, right? You just kind of find your way. So I think for a lot of students, we try to encourage them, especially in the first year. And true, if they're a little bit more, if their brains are wired for maths, physics, we do encourage them, like maybe it's better for mechanical engineering. Like if you can tell that storytelling with the idea in this kind of creative way, then you'll be happier there. Like you're not torturing yourself trying to come up with things that doesn't, that you don't have interest. So I think those are the things that are kind of, you have to kind of put yourself in that experience first and then try to relate it to these younger people that are still finding their ways of how to navigate.
Right.
I feel that the problem lies with the choice of words such as find a career. And I think when you give so much of responsibility to a word, okay, are you doing this because you're looking for a career? And I think that's what discourages a lot of students from other disciplines in engaging with art. And I think this is not only students, it's also the parents. I think it's also the way, the entire education system is built that, okay, you study and then the whole purpose is to find employment. And I think that's where the real problem lies. I think once we, I believe exposure to art, be it from any discipline, is important. And that just opens up a student's mind. And we talk about innovation and innovating. Innovation comes from imagination. I mean, how would you bring about imagination of a student if they have not really explored and lost themselves? In art, in any form of art. So I think once we disengage ourselves from those big words like finding a career, finding an employment, although I know for most people that is important, but they kind of lose the bigger picture here. They just, and I think that across I love working with people from different disciplines. I mean, I encourage my students to work with School of Business students, School of Architecture students. Like just yesterday, we are working with 2 students from architecture, and we are actually making a film with those students. And I have my students who are working with the students of architecture, and that's great because I think that's the synergy which really helps in really opening up imaginative thinking from both sides. So the architecture students will learn a lot, in terms of how are we going to tell their story through film, and where do we begin? And I think that's the real question here. Like, are we really training our students to just seek career in this area, or is it more than that?
Right, and actually it leads really nice on to my next question, is that we're talking about, well, we were originally talking about education and what it means to then, go into those careers, but how important is art outside of that? How important is arts for our development as human beings, and does it really need to be ingrained within education for needs outside of just getting a job and getting out of university? How else can it benefit us?
No, I mean, for sure, because that's why the arts in education really need to start from the earliest age, because it teaches kids and then later adults how to solve problems, how to, when you have an idea, how can you realize it, right? Of course, the easiest thing is to now order something on Amazon, you solve your problems, which it does many times, but from kids' perspectives, the small kind of limitations that they see, how can you kind of go over that barrier and figure it out on your own? So I'll tell a little story. We have this young man in the audience. They're visiting me from Bosnia. And he's very creative, always is kind of making things. And so recently they were telling me a story. He shares a bedroom with his brother, and the light switch turns, there are 2 rows of lights, but it regulates both rows. So if his brother wants to read and he wants to go to bed, he can do it, right? So one day he was working on stuff, and his mom came to the bedroom and was like, "What are you doing? What is this?" So he cut out, the lights are like embedded in the ceiling. So he had put the magnets around the rim of the light on the actual light. Then he's cut out a cardboard circular size that fits exactly the light, but on the cardboard he has glued coins. Then he's put that whole cardboard thing on the broomstick, And so when he's laying in bed, he wants to sleep, right? He just sticks it on the platform, on the light. The thing grabs the magnets, and he's got dark. His side of the room is dark. He can sleep or whatever. His brother is still reading. I mean, it sounds very, right, amateur. It's cardboard, it's magnets, but that's like being creative, like that's ingenuity. This is how we have great minds later on, right? And those things in some households seem just like, what do you mean, what are you doing? Like, that doesn't make sense. But those are the things that we need to, you know, like a little plant. You need to add water, let it grow into something much richer. Encourage those behaviors, those habits, those creativities. Because nobody wakes up, even when you finish school, university, you don't become like genius overnight, right? Whatever genius means anyways, like, you know, you don't become inventor overnight. It's these small little things that add up because your brain is trained to solve these problems, to find materials that you don't have, to find means that you don't have, but you will solve the problem, right? So this is what arts are really important, and arts are quite a spectrum of things, of what it should be. And so if kids are given these small problems to be solved through creativity of any, you know, now they're kind of pushing the STEM or STEAM, depending which school it is, incorporating the science and arts and math, all those things. I think those are very good programs. They need to be stronger. They need to be not limited. A lot of times when you ask kids now, what is STEAM, they'll say robotics, which is true. But that's not interesting for all the kids, you know? Yes, for a little bit, but not really. So sometimes all they need is some cardboard. And then they will really invent things. Like, they will look rudimentary and maybe not interesting like the expensive toys they have, but they will start creating things that eventually could become very much, you know, electronics and whatever. But it starts with like the simplest of materials and the simplest of ideas, right?
I mean, I completely agree. I mean, I just don't want to add anything to that. And it really makes a lot of sense. You know, you have to start with the fundamentals. And we get caught up with different buzzwords. I think AI, blockchain, you know, and then, you know, we kind of get lost and it, you know, just, you know, get so occupied with those buzzwords that we miss the fundamentals. And giving an example, you know, of why is it important, and, you know, look at UAE, for example. I mean, I remember in 2007, 2008, when the first Dubai International Film Festival had started, the number of films that were produced in the UAE and in the Gulf were very limited. But I could see that there were a lot of funding programs. There was something called Injaz, which started, and Imagination came, you know, later. And they also started their whole incubation, you know. It takes years. It takes years. I mean, and we were just discussing before this event. And just look at today. You have films being produced by filmmakers who may not necessarily come from the traditional area of filmmaking. So, and it's all, what is driving them is basically the urge of telling story, which is about this land, about the people that live here. And I think that's what we should aim at, is empowering voices so that they could tell the story which connects people that live here today. And I think UAE has kind of like started this long way back, and I think we are getting to see the results. I mean, last 2-3 months back, we had a release of the big blockbuster UAE film, Al Kamin, and, you know, it just broke all records. People who are working in those films, I mean, this is because of the result that, you know, things were done in the past.
Yeah, like several years ago, there was an effort that was put in to really start these programs. And it's interesting. Earlier, you were talking about STEM and STEAM, and I'm wondering how do we? There is still so much focus within schools and within families that, you know, you must focus on STEM to be successful. I mean, even when we're talking about STEAM, you said it's robotics. It's not architecture. It's not film. It's not graphic design. So how do we really start shifting that narrative and encouraging people to allow kids to get involved in this, and really showing that this is something that is so beneficial to the world, to our society?
Probably, from my point of view, I think we have, even though digital anything is obviously made a huge leap forward, and we can, there's a lot of success in how things are made creatively and in visual arts in general. But I think it needs to, again, go back to the basics, right? So that it's not that grade ones are taught how to use Photoshop or how to use platforms to make movies. It is exactly take photographs with analog cameras, make stamps instead, which would lead them into printmaking and collaging. So that it's very much like a tactile process, and they're all used to digital things and they learn so quickly. They basically need a day and they're masters in any of these things. But they need to kind of be, it needs to be a rewind to like the start. To really introduce, sometimes that's not interesting for kids because they already know enough to say like, why would I do this by hand when I know I can do I know when I ask my students to do hand-drawn, let's say, diagrams versus digital, they know in digital they can make 20 in an hour. They change colors, save it, they change sizes, they save it. When you're hand drawing, it's an hour per diagram, right? Because it takes longer to do it, obviously. And that's exactly, I make some requirements that you cannot use digital. But why, professor? Like, it's so much easier. I'm like, well, are you here because it's easier or you want to learn something, right? So you have to kind of put some restrictions to push them away of the things that they kind of know, not the full capacity, but they know enough to get by, and put them back into like the learning of really something that this generation, even maybe my generation, is kind of the last one on the cusp where we were still analog and then we're introduced into digital, to kind of bring that hands-on something experience, whether it's making stuff with clay or carving things to make a stamp, and then with that you can do all kinds of things, doing the photographs and doing, a sequence of analog photos to create motion, to show how things progress in time, to show basically time lapse, right? Versus slow motion video or time lapse video, which is so much easier. Click, click, you're done. 5 minutes, you have your project finished. But that's not the point, right?
I think we all are, we love talking about the greatness of digital media and everything. But the problem is speed. As a society, we've become so obsessed with speed. When we talk about journalism, like how fast can you produce a story? How fast can you put it out there in different platforms? Everybody is so obsessed with speed today, right? And I think that is the problem. Nobody is invested in reading a longer article. If you talk about, in-depth, longer article where you have to spend more than 5 minutes, I think that's a big ask. That please pay attention and read something.
For me, I'm looking at the 2-minute news video, not the
Exactly.
article.
30 seconds. 30 seconds. So speed is the problem, and there's whole emphasis on putting things out there without checking, which is also a big problem. So we are talking about, essentially the key problem with digital media is this whole emphasis on speed, and that is what I think what she was talking about, when we have to go back and let things be slow, where students have time to reflect, be thoughtful, and I think that's not happening. That's not happening.
I want to talk more about that. About analog creation and how that is different than digital, and what it can allow us to do. That within education, what can we learn that we can't with digital, and why is analog so special?
Well, one example that I have, like when they make handmade collages, if you're doing it digitally, it's so easy to change the scale, to make things fit perfectly, overlap images. I'm not saying they come out wonderful, right? They look great. You can change transparency. All these things are right there. When you're making a handmade collage or anything really, you have to really look for things. So you kind of you are the adjustment of size, of transparency, of scale, which means you are thinking more. You're thinking in depth versus just the surface, right? You're collecting images, information that will bring that two-dimensional picture into more in depth with scale and sizes and colors and how things connect to become more continuous throughout the image. So there is, yes, it's pain for students, But I think they sort of learn a little bit gradually to kind of appreciate it, and I believe it makes them actually better than in digital, because then they can, even though it's faster, but they learn the basics of what is the depth of field, what is the overlay, why are you layering, what are you trying to achieve, than if they just started with digital. You know, there's that kind of, I think, a different connection of making process.
I think that's where we're getting into the niche of art form, photographers today, and also I think if you see that there has been a lot of talk and about printing again, and you have lots of big companies that are again putting their bets on people printing. Okay, so you have basic Polaroid, and that's again catching up again. You have Canon coming up with new products where they are trying to let people print again. And I think that's the beauty of also when we talk about analog, which is that this whole idea that I'll fix it in the post. I think that is the most common problem that we kind of try to tell students, like, okay, you can fix it in the post, but let's not aim for it. So this whole idea that okay, because it is this medium is I wouldn't say easy, but it is so acceptable. You go wrong and it is okay. And that is where the problem is, because they think, okay, I can fix it in the post. And that's where I think going back and making mistakes and looking at the mistakes on print and figuring out, I think that's a much better way to learn than, okay, I'll fix it in the post.
That's the best question that students could ask in arts world, whatever it is. Is this correct, professor? Like, what is correct? I don't know. Is it? Do I have the answer sheet? We're not in a math test, but that's their favorite question. Like, is this correct? Not like, am I doing this right? Oh yeah, and that's the second one. Do you like it? Well, does it really matter if I like it or not, or you like it or not? The tyranny
of the consensus. Let's get a consensus that okay, this is how it is and how it should be.
And I think sometimes with analog as well is that, as you say, you can learn so much by making a mistake, and sometimes. Maybe what comes out through that mistake is better than what you originally planned. You're shooting for this idea of perfection, but with analog you can, with like analog photography, for example, maybe something's overexposed, it gives a little effect that is new, and now you can take that into another art project. I do want to take our conversation a little bit back to the schools and back to the curriculum. So, I mean, arts is not very common within the school curriculums within the UAE, and certainly have less attention. And how do we then integrate creative projects and the arts into these already packed curriculums, especially when we're already cutting half a day out of our weeks?
Well, I don't know about other parents, but I'm on this like extreme side where I absolutely give okay for 4 days a week, not even 4.5. Honestly, I think kids will thrive when they're free and flexible, when they don't have homework, when they actually are using their creativity in a indirect way to do homework, right? If they're studying physics, they will build stuff out of Legos and things that they have, and they will see, like, visually what is gravity, what is, action, reaction. They will test physics. They don't need to do like 10 problems over the weekend or read chapters. Give them something that they create. Any project, any subject, even English, right, which is text, can be introduced in a way that there's a project that they take the content and then they put a spin on their own creative way. I think schools are very stiff, especially before universities, even universities really, but that at least starts to branch out in more specifics. But I think the lower level schools are very stiff, no matter what, whether it's American, British, Australian curriculum. They want to do it, but because of this pressure of like, we have to get this down, the check boxes, they get a little bit too obsessed of how to test and how to check knowledge and then tell parents, your child has an A in this and B in this, and they should work, instead of just letting these kids really thrive. Okay, you're not good in math. Not everybody has to be good in math. You can do other things, right? And I think the labeling also, both from the society in general, so from peers to parents to even teachers, of this pressure that you're not good at something, Therefore, you have to work much harder to satisfy this imaginary society requirement that you should be good, like that C is a bad grade, but it's a fine grade if that's not what interests you, or that you don't, you know. So I think there's a lot of, there could be, yes, the curriculums are packed, but there's also so much flexibility in what really should be done for these kids to go through the educational journey, still learn things, but have much more flexible mind. I come from a very, let's say, strict sort of post-communist education in Bosnia, which was former Yugoslavia, and there was no play. We never did anything creative except in arts. In arts, you draw, in music, you sing. Everything else is study, test, study, test, study, test. I mean, I turned out okay, I think, but you know, the point is really like it should be this flexible, not to like, I'm not saying like to play and stuff in school. Do the work in school, but at home, they should be encouraged to be much more free and not do repetitive homework stuff and projects that are stiff to again reflect what the curriculum says, as opposed to you now interpret it your way. Maybe it'll be very different, unexpected, what they haven't seen before. Maybe it's even off the topic, but they will express what they thought they learned about any of these things.
Is that for the parents or the teachers, do you think?
Both. Because you have parents that, you know, are now trying everything in Sharjah to change the 4-day into, again, 5-day. My kids are not in, they're in kind of like a homeschooling program in a way. But I mean, even if I was, I think it's great. Having 3 days, it's amazing for all of us, but especially for kids. They need that play. They learn through play. That is the way. They learn everything, not just arts, but in particular, you know, the creativity comes along. My daughter comes home and she says, oh, let me show you this new card game. And then the name is some wacky game because kids come up, the weirder the name, the better, right? And then the rules are so silly, it doesn't make sense at all, but they made it up, like, and that's how it comes through, right?
So I don't know if you have anything to add on.
Yeah, I'm just scared of the word standardization, you know, and I think that goes from schools to accreditation bodies to policymakers. I think how much of standardization do we need to make sure that a student has gone through a rigorous assessment process to prove their competency and so and so. And I think that's where this whole, you know, conflict with, you know, arts comes into play, because you cannot standardize everything in arts. And the other problem I have is, again, like if I go to a school to talk about, you know, films or photography or whatsoever, I kind of only get students who are in studying in arts. And then the students who are in science, they are just said, okay, this is not for you. Okay, we will arrange something for you, you know, when we have some scientists coming over, and you know, so that is where the problem is. You know, I think it's more to do with the teachers. You know, they just do not understand that, okay, they need to be exposed to both. I mean, film is art and science. There's as much of art in film as there's as much of science in film.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's something that I think most people don't understand.
So do you think, is that about bringing the students into those art classrooms, or is it about bringing the creativity and the art into the engineering classrooms, into the English classrooms?
Yeah, I think I just feel that we should break the walls, and I think we should just make sure that everybody is getting a chance to you know, explore what is not on the book, what is not standardized. You know, so I think that has to begin with the teachers. We need to, I think, first train the teachers, understand that, you know, you need to look beyond and not compartmentalize the students, and so that they just follow a certain path. And I think we have to be broader, we have to be open, and I think that's where it should begin.
What would you say to these, for both of you, what would you say to these teachers to try and encourage them to really open the box?
Well, I think it's, again, you know, these preconceptions of what's accepted as like good creative expression versus, okay, or super talented, right? So if, let's say, sculpture, like little kids, obviously, if they're working with clay, they'll come up with some kind of blob and say, here's the camel, and it has legs this big, right? So, but that's what they see. You know, there's one, I remember seeing this a couple of years ago, a parent who took his kids drawing of different animals and just in general things, and then he photoshopped the real, like let's say giraffe. So the daughter drew giraffe that has a neck this big, like it looked more like a cow, let's say, in proportions. And then he took the actual picture of the giraffe and he photoshopped it to exactly the proportions of that drawing. Just to show, okay, it's how they perceive things, how they read and interpret scale and size and relationship between the parts. And so I think, again, goes back to encouraging versus discouraging. So it's the same with teachers, right? Especially if they're in these, if they don't themselves have the background in different streams, if they are just science teacher, then maybe the flexibility is less, but they need to sort of understand that kids have different approaches. Science, we perceive often that it's rules, which should be steps that you should follow, instruction, right? So there is logic there. But sometimes if you, I'm sure somebody over the centuries has made some kind of a mistake of not following instruction, and then we got a new element, or we created a new material, right? So yes, sometimes these things are accidental, but we should know by now that they're good accidents, and that we learn from them, mistakes, accidents, whichever we want to call them, and to allow these students to really kind of experiment. I think that's what it boils down to from the teacher's perspective, that there isn't a single, even in math, yes, 2 + 2 is 4, but outside of that rigor of basic algebra and numbers, everything else, there isn't a single answer. There's different interpretations that, yes, they could be way off, but if you can justify it as a young mind to learn how to explain why you think this is the way you're saying or drawing or doing it, then maybe it leads somewhere. Not immediately, kind of taken off the table and say, no, that's not correct, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's very important that you let mistakes happen, and I think for teachers particularly, of course, exposure is the key. Will be the key ingredient for them to actually make some changes. So the teachers needs to be definitely exposed, and I think to a large extent, because of the way, again, coming back to the same point, even science students, when they have to present something, I met a group of students who had done some really innovative project, and the time came where they had to pitch it, they had to present it, and then they were looking at, okay, what's the best form to present it, and that's when they got me to talk to them, and then that's when they realized that, okay, we have to now, there's a point we have to express it, we have to make it work, and even though it is really, really a hardcore scientific project, but they have to pitch it, they have to dumb it down in a way.
There's a storytelling element.
Exactly. So I was brought in to just tell them and help them to build the story around. And you need to also, to convince people today. I mean, this is the problem with, with COVID, right? The scientists knew the answers, but they just could not communicate because they're bad communicators, right? I mean, look at US, look at all countries across the world. I mean, they just knew the answers. They just could not communicate it. And I think that's the, the answer to the discussion we're having here. Even it is science. Science needs to learn to communicate. And that can only happen when they open doors, break the walls, and meet art, So,
maybe they can learn something from us.
yes, of course.
I would like to open the floor to any questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, either for Selma, Sabir, or both, if you could just either raise your hand or come up to the front, and we'll be over there. I'll come over and hand you the mic. I think that might be easier.
Actually, I came late a little bit. I don't know. I was not picking up what you are talking about, so you have to tell me the tip. Only little bit what you are talking about.
Yeah, so Salma, Sabir, if you could maybe just briefly kind of summarize everything we've talked about for those who maybe came a bit late. Like, we're talking about education in the arts. Maybe reintroduce yourself a little again for those who weren't before, and then.
Yeah, I think it's the focus of this discussion is to highlight the importance of overlapping different mediums of education, in particular from the more kind of rigid curriculums, and then how does the arts kind of fit in it. That the arts is not just for true artists that can paint, that can draw exactly the portraits, and the rest, when we see any kind of art, and if we don't understand it, that, well, why are they doing this, right? So that we need to really educate all of us as society and introduce it early on in schools and in education of kids to learn to appreciate any form of arts. Now, arts can be from the literary text to sculptures and films and everything in between, right? So any kind of, as Sabir talked about a lot, storytelling, that can be in many different forms, not just reading a book or listening to your grandfather tell you stories from back in the day, right? So there are different ways that we can understand and retell the same story using different platforms of arts.
Yeah, that pretty much summarizes everything. Thank you so much.
Very effectively said. Are there any other questions from the audience? All right, well, we were kind of talking about mistakes earlier, and you acted like you were quite proud of your students sometimes when they make those mistakes, but are there any other moments or what else makes you really feel proud about your students when they do something, and what makes you kind of go home at the end and they go, yes, they did a really good job there?
Well, you can go. I've been sort of hogging the mic. Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, for me, I think the COVID-19, that last 2 years, has been really a true test to what the students can do within limitations. I think when COVID hit and we had to limit ourselves to online classes, I think because I teach a visual medium and we have to be out and about, and that's what we like to do. So the very challenge, and I think this is what really prepares the students for any eventuality, is work within limitations. Sometimes it sounds great that, okay, do whatever you want, use whatever you want, there is no restriction, it sounds good, but trust me, that's not life. In real life, you have lots of limitations, you have lots of difficulties, so they often ask, how long should the video be? And obviously there are lots of more questions that follows. So limitations, working within limitations, and what they did during COVID and what my students achieved, I'm really proud of what they did, taking in consideration the limitations that they faced. So we produce films by sitting at home, we produce TV shows by sitting at homes. We learn to work in collaboration, online technology, putting it all together. I think that's what really was what my key takeaway from the last 2 years.
And sometimes limitations actually foster the creativity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we'll kind of start wrapping up. So I do want to just give a final chance for anyone on the floor to ask any questions if they want. All right. So if not, then we'll just wrap up with one final question, which is just if you had to really kind of encourage students, whether, we've talked into this over again, but maybe there's just some final words there, to encourage the students, the parents, the policymakers, and you have to do that in one sentence. What would you say to really start going,
now
right,
you're asking for impossible things.
well, work within limitations.
Although, currently I have a project with students that's a 3D project, but they need to create a design statement after they've done research. And I don't limit them to one sentence. Because
elevator pitch.
Because they would never, the sentence would be probably 3 miles long. But a couple of sentences, and they still struggle with it, right, of how to. But I think really the message is we always talk about this kind of back in the old days and how it was done, and look, we accomplished all these things even though we didn't have this advanced things. There's truth in that, but I also believe we need to take advantage of things where we are right now. There is technology, there is so much innovation. We can't just say, okay, now type on a typewriter. It doesn't make sense, right? But I think it's important to be aware of how and when you teach the students which of these skills. So to introduce more of arts in education, I think that the lawmakers, teachers, curriculum committees, they need to revise it. Some of it is very old and kind of ancient in terms of not the content, content is more or less the same. Newton laws are Newton laws, right? They're not going to change that to explain what happens. But there's definitely a different approach, because you talked about speed and how students or young people perceive things, right? Because they've seen so much without anybody's input, often they know at least some, so when the lecture or lesson comes, they sort of like it's familiar and they're not interested in a detailed explanation. They've seen it, you know, they kind of know a bit. So it needs to be a different approach, and that's, I think, again, using a bit more of what they haven't seen. And what they haven't seen is the analog, really, because, you know, like my daughter, for example, like when I showed her analog camera, she's like, what do you mean there's no like preview? You don't know what picture you're taking? I'm like, no, until you do 36 or 24 photos, then you develop, and then you realize half of them are not good.
Usable.
And it's like blows their mind, like how is that possible, right? So they do need to be introduced into like really basics. I think the schools are even relying, aside from COVID and online school that we were forced to do, it was easier to give them computers to type up, because it's done, it's easier for them to check, right? They can do it in bed, homework is easier, or whatever assignments, than going through notebooks. So yes, we're all adjusting to this kind of advancement in what makes our lives, let's say, more comfortable and easier. But it's also, okay, what are we doing with this time that we're gaining? Nothing. We're just keeping ourselves perpetually busy for not really a good reason, right? So it's like slowing it down and learning some of these basic things along with technology and innovation that we have, and then packaging it together to make more progress.
And any final
That's
words?
definitely more than a sentence.
Well, elevator pitch.
For me, I think taking cues from what she mentioned, I completely agree with that. Time to reflect. I think every technology developer, be it AI, blockchain, you name it, it should make life easy, but also should give people enough time to reflect. And I think just the very fact that we all are in the business of storytelling, and everybody, every discipline is trying to tell a story. And I think recognition of that whole idea that, okay, if I am able to tell a story, which makes people stop and reflect, and be it through technology, be it through any other means, I think that should be our focus, rather than getting things done fast and being more efficient, you know, and losing out on the larger picture.
Like we said before, we can't do anything without storytelling, and education in the arts is so important to be able to really do that. Well, thank you, Sabir and Selma, for joining us for the speaker series today. For those of you who joined late, Selma Catovic Hughes is the US mission to the UAE Artist Grant recipient, and she's the instructor at the American University of Sharjah. Her sculptures are available to see in Bay 7, up along, you can see where I'm pointing if you're at the stage, it's over there. And Dr. Sabir Haque is the assistant professor at the American University of Khaimah in the Digital Media and Video Production Department. So thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.